So welcome. This is a conversation with a cohort of amazing leaders called the Black Women of the South cohort. And I got to know this project through Phyllis Hill, the organizing director at Faith in Action. We want to open today's conversation by asking you to share a bit, Phyllis. How did you come to bring these incredible women together, and for what purpose? And how's it been feeling for y'all to work together a little bit across your states?
Well, thank you. Yes, my name is Phyllis Hill. I'm the National Organizing Director for Faith in Action. My story really begins in Hazelhurst, Georgia, a really small town. It's about, 5,000 people. I grew up primarily with my grandmother, and I think her story, my relationship with her, is the reason why I'm able to be in great community with the women in the South. So some of the things that she was able to teach me was, what does it mean to be a Black woman, and what does it mean to share basically kind of all of yourself in a very joyful way. One was through the church. That was number one. She was a staunch missionary Baptist church lady, and went to all of the meetings, all of them, and that really kind of showed me about how Black women show up in spaces. Not all the time as the lead pastor, because in some ways I didn't learn till much later that at the time we couldn't preach. That was devastating to learn later on as I was an adult. But I saw all the Black women do all the work, everything, from whether that's ushering, whether that's getting the food, getting the communion together, cleaning up, all those sort of things. So I knew that, there was something there to learn and also fight for, to be recognized. The second thing that my grandmother, along with that, she was deep into things like Eastern Star and Herons of Jericho. And there are these kind of orders that spoke to the Blackness, spoke to our own culture, spoke to who we are, that was being defined outside of whiteness. And so it was really good to be a part of every summer. There would be these huge conventions for the Herons of Jericho. So I saw Black people at their finest, wearing their crowns, wearing their jewelry, in their Cadillacs, all these sort of things that I just thought was miraculous as a child. And then the third thing that I would say is that my grandmother was an educator, and she was a teacher in the segregated schools and the integrated schools. And she also went to HBCUs because I just, what was offered to her. And so I kind of got an appreciation of these Black institutions. But there was one question that she always asked. She was asking, she asked once, and I think it always stuck with me, which is, there was a difference she was trying to describe between the integrated school and the segregated schools. And with my mind of a child, I couldn't grasp it. But basically, what she was saying is that the difference is that you couldn't, there was no care and nurture for Black children in the integrated school. And that stuck with me about why that is. Why didn't you just care? I mean, teachers by nature aren't supposed to be caring. Aren't they supposed to be loving? Aren't they supposed to be nurturing? And I couldn't grasp it about why. And it wasn't until years later, I thought that I was going to do this work by way of, I'm talking about justice work, being a professor. That didn't work. But that's another story. But when I started doing organizing, when I really won my first major campaign, I would say major, understood what organizing was and the reach to the people, I began with this question that my grandmother asked to superintendents and to teachers, people who had a lot of credentials, a lot of, alphabet behind their name, about how did they nurture and how did they care for Black children. And they were stunned into silence. Matter of fact, there was one person who was a Black educator, a Black man who was a principal, who said, I've never been asked that question. Everybody said they've never been asked that question. And for me, that's how I show up in this work. How are we caring for, how are we nurturing Black people? From money to how we organize, to why we organize, all of that. All of what I just described about my grandma, that shows up in this space. So when I came back to the South from 7.5 years of organizing in Minnesota, before then in 2013, there was I read an article that Georgia was going to turn blue. And I was like, let me get my behind back to Georgia. I do not want to miss out on this. But more to the point, as Reverend Dr. Gould, Cassandra Gould, who is the executive director of Missouri Faith Voices, she said something that really kind of just stuck with me. This wasn't about turning Georgia blue or any place blue. This was about turning it black and brown. And so when I know that when I went back to the South, that I was going to have to find some black and brown people. And one of the first people that I was actually introduced to or told to be introduced to was Nsé. It took us a while to get there. It took me about a year. But I'm glad that I kind of spent a year traveling. I lived in New Orleans. I lived in Birmingham. And I learned in Tampa in 2016. I learned a lot. I lived there. And then I lived in Texas for a whole year in Dallas, then moved to Atlanta. And in the middle of that, I had a great conversation with Nsé. And there was something very, she had a great analysis. I'm pretty sure she could tell you about Georgia and how to move it. And it sounded just righteous, and it sounded right. And then she said, well, I have 1,100 congregations and there's no money to move it. And I was like, well, let me see what I can do about that. I felt like that was just like, it was just unbelievable to me. Why wouldn't someone want to invest in this analysis? Why wouldn't somebody to invest in insight? I didn't get it. And that to me became a question again I began to ask all the time. Why weren't people investing in Black women? Why weren't they investing in Pastor Rhonda? Why wasn't they investing in Stephanie Strong in Alabama, Akila in Texas, Ashley in Louisiana, Tamika in Memphis? I didn't know all those women all at once, really until like the end of last year. But that's what it was, that if we were going to move the South, it was the investment in their leadership, their brilliance, their thinking, and then trusting that. And so in basically earlier this year, I basically got on the phone with each of them and basically said, let's go for it. Let's come together and let's figure out a way in which that we can create a container, and that then we can say, here's our experience. Here's how we would like to be invested in. Here's the way that we want to move in the world. And so I basically kind of just took all of their experiences and say, hey, let's create something new. And so I am better for it as an organizer. They always keep me on my toes and always challenge me to show up, as my grandmother and her questions challenged me to do the same. So I don't know if there's anything else you would like to bring to say, but that's.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. Maybe we should go around and hear from a couple others and say, let's go to Georgia and just hear a little bit about how do you come to this group and to this work, but also say a word about the strategies you're using. How are you building power and making change in Georgia?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I am most challenged by is that far too often, all of the divisions and the failures and the deficiencies that exist in the sort of dominant society also exist in our movement, right? So I'm an immigrant, right? I became a US citizen my senior year in high school. And thinking about the wide chasm and the gaps between Latinx organizing and African and Caribbean immigrant organizing and AAPI immigrant organizing. That's all happening in the North Atlanta suburbs in completely different silos. And I see it as it's such a clear example of how we are letting power sort of slip through our fingers, because again, some of the divisions that exist in the dominant society still exist in our movement. I think people probably vote. I'd like to think that we are more, but I'm clear that people probably best know NGP for our large scale voter registration work. But it was never about putting VR numbers on the board. So while I am super proud of the fact that we are coming up on our 500,000th voter registered just in the state of Georgia. What's more important is that I'm clear what adding 500,000 Black, brown, queer, and young people does to an electorate in a place like Georgia. One, a lot has been written, a lot has been said about the changing demographics in our country, the browning of America, if you will, and nowhere are those changes happening as sort of acutely and aggressively than in the Deep South, and particularly in a place like Georgia. The demographic changes that are happening there are massive. They're happening very, very quickly. And they're unique and unlike the shifts that are happening in other parts of the country. Massive because 2 million people have moved to the state. Happening very quickly because 2 million people have moved to the state in the past decade, just since the last census. And 81% of them are people of color. And they're unique because unlike Arizona, where they are also on the same timeline, it is not being driven by Latinx immigration. That is very much a part of it, but it is primarily being driven by what political scientists and demographers are calling the reversal of the Great Migration. So Black people who fled the South in between the 1920s and the 1970s, they or their children are moving back south, right? So Black folks, college educated Black people from New York and DC and Philadelphia and Chicago and LA are moving to Atlanta. I think it's also important to point out that, Atlanta is now, Black Hollywood, and more movies are filmed. I mean, this is obviously pre-COVID, but more movies are filmed in Atlanta than in New York and LA. And so it has created an entire new industry that Native Georgians are not benefiting from, but we can talk about that as well. But I say all that to say that even in a time where the world feels like it's shifting under our feet, that and demographics are changing, that we were still losing. And so I'm very clear, and so are our staff and our leaders, that demographics don't equal destiny. That we absolutely have to organize, and that there wasn't infrastructure. There's a narrative that is sold about Atlanta being a Black Mecca. There's also a narrative about Atlanta and Georgia being the cradle of the civil rights organizations, but people were doing this work as their 5 to 9, not their 9 to 5. So we didn't have a cohort of organizers who could, connect a win with a win with a win until we're building the power that we need. And so, just off of like sheer intestinal fortitude, as people call it, like there were these Black women, holding up the sky, again, while also working full-time jobs, and let's keep it 100% real, also doing more than their fair share of whatever their domestic responsibilities are. And so when Stacey and I sought to launch the New Georgia Project back in 2014, the idea was that how do we professionalize, the organizing that is happening, number one, but number two, how do we define what a win is? Because here's the thing, progressives across the country, but also in the South, are very good at reframing losses as victories, right? We didn't lose that bad. Well, they did have a 75% supermajority in the legislature. So we live to fight another day. And I want to get to a place where we're actually winning. I'm obsessed with winning. I'm obsessed with winning for our families, and then defending those wins beyond an election cycle. And so I'm not going to be happy until Georgia's $5.15 minimum wage is moved. And because our current crop of elected officials are not embarrassed by that, we're firing them. And so, and it's funny because nobody believed that it would happen. Like, I love how much love Leader Abrams gets out in these streets. But I remember traveling around the country talking about the opportunity in Georgia and talking about the opportunity in the South and talking about investing in Black-led organizations and leadership. And people kind of shrugged us and dismissed us because of the narrative that they have about what it means to win in the South. So there's an assumption that we are not sophisticated, and that's not the case at all. We are criminally underinvested in, and there's no path to victory without Black voters, without brown voters. There's no path to victory without the labor of Black women. And so what does it look like to not suck every ounce of creativity out of us and leverage it for these short-term gains? What if we were able to keep some for ourselves and continue to invest in, again, infrastructure so that Mississippi isn't begging for dollars every time there is a potential to get a Black elected candidate, a Black candidate elected statewide? What if there was year in and year out voter registration that was focused on building power over the long term? The reason that we keep kicking the Secretary of State's behind in court is because it's a part of our long-term strategy. And having people invest in that means that I don't hate myself, my family doesn't hate me, and I don't quit and go back to doing, family law so that I could help the ex-wives of really wealthy men get their just desserts and feed myself and my family. And I'd like to not do that. Right? Like, I'd like to continue to do the work that we're doing, one, but also two, I think that the South just suffers from bad PR. And so being able to link up with Rhonda and Phyllis and our sisters in states across the other South, it just helps us to push back on the narrative. Like, we are doing incredible things with zero resources and specifically in terms of, again, narrative change, narrative shift, storytelling. So, I mean, many of our organizations are more effective than county and state parties. And so we are a proper part of an ecosystem, a progressive ecosystem that is going to carry us through, again, from one election cycle to another. And people know it. So, like, let's stop pretending like you don't rely on our organizations and on our work to get the job done. Let's have a real conversation about what it looks like to win. Again, not these losses that we reframe as wins because, oh, it's the South, it's Jim Crow South, etc. Like, no, what does it mean to invest in Black leadership? So that's how I come to the work. And basically, I do whatever Phyllis tells me. I could have just started there and ended there, quite frankly.
Well, we don't want you to go back into family law. We want you to keep doing this. If you are leveraging demographic changes and a diverse, expanding electorate and truly building power, you have got to be freaking out the white power structure that is. Yes. What kind of pushback are y'all experiencing? What are the challenges? Is it around this issue of narrative? Is it the disinformation campaigning that dissuades your base from engaging or voting? Like, what are you up against? I mean, besides not enough resources, which is clear.
Well, what are we up against? So there are currently 1,000 Georgians being investigated for quote unquote voter fraud, for double voting, quote unquote. I won't use that language publicly, but that's the language that the Secretary of State is using. So there are 1,000 Georgians that are being investigated for double voting. They, each of them faces up to 10 years in prison and $100,000 in fines. And the major challenge, it's ridiculous charges. It has everything to do with the Secretary of State and their failure to give people notice that they had received their absentee ballots, right? So folks sent out their absentee ballot and never heard back about whether or not the county received it. So what did they do? They showed up on election day to vote, and there was an affidavit that you could sign that said, cancel my absentee ballot whenever it arrives. But we also monitor, our voter protection volunteers monitored 25 polling locations that ran out of affidavits, and people were instructed to just call the county when they get home. Right. And so now these same people are being charged or being investigated and possibly charged with voter fraud. So one, that's going to have a chilling effect on people's participation in the election. But the major challenge there is that there haven't been criminal defense lawyers with voting rights expertise since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we're scrambling across the state of Georgia when we found out that basically there's one lawyer in Georgia who is a criminal defense attorney who has defended clients in a voting case, then we realized that we need to do some training. So now we're working with a lot of the criminal defense bars across the state to train them on how to defend clients in voting rights cases. And so that's like a missing part of the infrastructure that we need in order to, there's just so much. And because the scope and the scale and the size of our work, like we are constantly running up against holes, gaps, deficiencies in the infrastructure, number one. Number two, we do this work behind enemy lines. Right. So while, Georgia is, 4 years away, 5 years away from being a majority people of color state, there are tons of counties in Georgia that are majority people of color, like Black and Latinx folks would make up 70% of the county, and there's never been a Black mayor. There's never been a Latinx mayor or a county commissioner. That it's all white power structure, right? So an aggressive sort of voter suppression mechanism coupled with violence. I'm going to keep it all the way real. Not only concealed carry, open carry state, right? You can bring your guns to church. You can bring it, in the state of Georgia. And so a real concern is, the retaliation. I get phone calls in the middle of the afternoon when we have canvassers that are handcuffed sitting on a street corner because a police officer has been called because someone thought that they were casing the neighborhood and trying to, plan a home invasion. Now, I'm not saying that I've ever robbed a house, because I haven't. But I'm not going to wear highlighter yellow shirts that say New Georgia Project Action Fund and have a clipboard and then match with my robbery partner. We're going to wear the same with our pressed khaki pants. Are you serious? So I think that...
Well, it's clearly a skin color issue, not a like what you're wearing issue, right?
Facts. But so, how do we prepare? So a part of our coalition are, again, our legacy sort of civil rights veterans who are committed to nonviolence, and then managing, how do we prepare folks to do voter protection at polling locations where we might possibly be met with violence. And so that's an issue. I think Dixiecrats are very much still a thing. The idea that, there's the good old boys who are really challenged in this moment because of the sort of boldness of our plans and the boldness of our language. Let me tell you, nobody is giving us the blues about defund the police like our well-meaning, well-intentioned progressives, white progressives. I mean, and some of our older progressives of color, it gives them heartburn to think about how we wrestle with that and what that means. And people want to police the language and not address the heart of the proposal. So that's also a challenge I think that we are facing as we try to sort of step out boldly. And it doesn't even feel radical at this moment. Breonna Taylor was murdered, but there are no murderers? How is that possible, right? And so that doesn't feel bold. It feels just. And I think that, again, you asked what are some of the obstacles that we face in this moment. And I think it's a crisis of imagination, or a lack of imagination on the part of the broader progressive movement, that people want to put one foot in front of the other and like just keep our heads down and get Biden elected and like everything will go back to normal. And that's not true. So we should stop, like we should disabuse ourselves of that and stop lying.
Before we bring Pastor Rhonda into the conversation and loop Phyllis in, let me just follow up on your point. It's true. Some of this doesn't feel radical in this moment. The terrain is shifting fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I share your view as an organizer that this is about winning. It's not about doing more meetings, that's for sure, right? It's about actually making real change. So are you experiencing the shifting moment as advantageous to our work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, if there's a silver lining to be found in this moment that we're in, it is that, look what working people are able to accomplish when we aren't working 3 and 4 jobs and doing rideshare and Uber Eats to try to make ends meet, right? That people are actually connecting the dots between like the act of voting, this moment, this election, the fact that we don't have healthcare, the fact that 80% of the people that have been hospitalized due to COVID in Georgia are Black and brown. Like folks are connecting the dots in like really powerful and what feel like permanent ways. I think that there's a maturity, sort of a maturation, I think, in sort of the movement for Black lives, but all of the justice movements that we are affiliated with, partner with, involved with, that, there's okay, pardon me because this is going to be particularly violent language, but I'm just telling you how we talk amongst ourselves. The idea is like, are you going to take a bullet to the head or are you going to take a bullet to the leg, right? Like that, we're taking a bullet on November 3rd. So as progressive organizers, as racial justice organizers, as climate justice organizers, like we're getting shot. So is it to the head or to the leg? And that is resonating, quite frankly, with our woker than thou contingent, who feel like direct actions are the path to, is the exclusive path to liberation. So yeah, people are getting it in this moment. I've been getting a lot of questions from reporters about, showing up at protests and whether or not people are going to show up to go vote in November. And I think that the June primaries in Georgia demonstrated that folks absolutely are. There was historic participation in the Democratic primary in 2020 in Georgia in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so, and our asterisk governor and our secretaries of state are playing games with the election. There's a special election next Tuesday in Georgia to fill the unexpired term of Congressman Lewis. But there are also like 113 people running. So there's going to be a runoff on December 1st, which means there's another election before November 3rd and after November 3rd. And there's also a candidate on the November 3rd ballot to run for the full 2-year term, right? And so imagine on a phone call or in a text message, because we're not on doors, trying to explain to a young voter in Atlanta that they need to show up September 29th, November 3rd, December 1st, and January 5th. Right? And we're doing it, and it's working. And so the point is, what do they say? If you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. And so we knew that they were coming with all of their BS in this moment. And because we are ready, we've been able to ride the ups and downs with our registrants and with our members.
All right, lots to unpack there, from, how is it going with the coalitions of the woke to the role of direct action and the tactical choices that you each face every day. Pastor Rhonda, let's bring Florida into this conversation and the work you do there, which absolutely is about leading as a person of faith, leading as an organizer, building bridges across the incredible diversity of communities in your state. Now, all eyes are on Florida because it's widely believed that as Florida goes, so will go the top of the ticket, and that therefore we may know earlier than some people say what the results are. We've all watched the game-changing work of Amendment 4 to bring our returning citizens back. How are you feeling as an organizing leader? How do you feel about our chances of success? What are the strategies working for you? I think you got a mute button.
Well, I'm just thinking and saying, where do I start? As a faith leader, I was introduced to racism in such a young age, and to see that not much has happened or changed since then. And then coming in as a faith leader, I personally knew that my work went beyond the pulpit. It was, I just believe I was called to do a work that just goes beyond the pulpit. And that was truly by building relationships, real relationships with clergy across the state, that they too will feel the same, that our work has to go beyond the pulpit. It has to go beyond um, our burying mostly Black men and women, whether it's gun violence from our own peers or either through the harassment of law enforcement. Our work had to go beyond um, allowing elected officials to come in our church and profit and pimp us for a season until they get into place. And so, where we are now and how we're looking at Florida, Florida is extremely bipolar. That's that's without a shadow of a doubt. Um, we're at the point where we're trying to understand and distinguish who is Black and who's brown, because in Florida, brown is often brown at its convenience, at their convenience. And how do we bring all of that into one place to see that we have more in common than what separates us? So we've been doing a whole lot of strategizing on how do we win Florida across the state? How do we hold elected officials accountable? And how do we no longer allow them to come into our space of worship to tell another prophet a lie and we not hold them totally accountable and even reminding them who they work for? What has been really good is that we realize that we have won more locally by bringing faith, all faith together and sitting at the table having some real conversations about the pain that actually lies in our communities and even in our own personal lives. Um, One of the great things, and I'm going to share one of the great things, is that um, this is the first time I've been able, in my way of organizing, is to organize the largest Souls to the Polls in this state. And when I say that, that's going into areas that often is overlooked. And that's those rural areas in North Florida, like Jasper, Florida, and Madison County and Perry, Florida, who no one normally even recognizes. Establishing great partnerships with um, the Miami Heat is in partnership with Faith in Florida in pushing Souls to the Polls. And so that's been one thing, but another thing is to be very intentional about our ground zero areas who is often targeted for voter suppression, which is Miami-Dade County, Broward County. And we know that there's other areas, but we experience voter suppression like no other. But also to celebrate that we only had 10 dead people to vote during the primary. Uh, so, and that being a celebration because we often have much more than 10. So we could see a little progress, but yet we also experience in one precinct, 700 voters being turned away because they were at the wrong precinct and no one was there to direct them to the right precinct. Or in Broward County where they was directed to a precinct that was closed. and to come back to say we went there, it was closed, but still not being able to vote because of the overwhelming way of them making sure that they make it as hard as possible for particularly Black voters to vote, or to be purged, and we not know that we were being purged from the system, or not to even make accessibility for the handicapped and our elderly people. And they told us up front, we will not do that. So Faith in Florida and the work that we've done, we've been a part of 10 lawsuits against SOE offices in the state, and we won. And unfortunately, we have to keep reminding them of what the judge says. So that it's been challenging, but the great thing is that I have so many faith leaders across the state who's playing an active part in monitoring what takes place during not just early voting, but also the day of election. We've created boiler rooms where if there's a problem at a precinct, we have attorneys on site to respond. And it's hard to plan for the unexpected, because often, like, Souls to the Polls is huge for us here in Florida, but to know that there are some supervisor of elections office know that, when those Black people get out of church, we're going to close the precinct down, and they do. And because this is basically Black churches that lead this form of our work. We are celebrating that we're getting ready to have our first Latino Souls to the Polls in Orange County. That's extremely new for us, but also we're putting a lot of emphasis on the millennials and targeting a work that they lead, and they also attract other millennials to get out to vote. It's been so far really, really successful in the planning process. So we're really putting a lot of focus, not just on voter turnout, but what is it that we have to do to protect our votes? And knowing that we have ground zero areas that's targeted. And for instance, Miami-Dade County, that's not an elected position. That's appointed by the mayor, who is now running for Congress. And so we want to make sure that he loses as Congress, number one. He could retire or begin looking at retirement because he was an awful mayor, because he allowed so much to happen when it comes to voter suppression under his leadership, and he condoned it and not allowed for what we will look at as protecting our votes in a more meaningful way. He publicly said he didn't need the support of the Black church. And so what we want to do is make sure that that comes to pass as he runs for Congress, that he will not get our support. And so that's just a little part of what we're doing and how we're focusing. Voter protection is extremely important, and voter turnout, and also just continuing to assist Desmond. And our churches are playing a major role with the fines and fees, whether we are financially supporting it or gathering as many returning citizens as possible to go through the process of getting their fines and fees paid, helping them register to vote, and making sure that they don't have a problem at the polls like what some of them did during our primary last month. So Desmond and I are like two peas in a shell in pushing this. And so, that's why it was so painful for me to know what he experienced this morning, knowing that he, what all he's put into it. It's just so unfortunate. And all that does is just gather us together to be more pissed off and to respond to being pissed off, to make sure that hopefully the governor and who's in office now as what one would call a president, enjoy being in Palm Beach together playing golf.
Well, the one thing I'm getting to know about each and every one of you is that the more pissed off you are, the more you're going to organize.
Yes.
So that's good news. Well, let me ask you this. The other place Florida's been in the news which is true across this region of our country, is about COVID and how COVID's been managed. And as Nsé said, COVID's had a disproportionate impact in Black and Brown communities. Rhonda, how has that affected your organizing around voter engagement and voter turnout and education? And has it changed how you do the organizing? And are there any lessons from what we've had to adapt under COVID for going forward?
Well, it's a big change. Just a week ago, I was a part of the roundtable with Senator Harris about how COVID has impacted just Miami-Dade County alone. Not that, I mean, we have one, and my daughter is on the front line as a nurse, an ICU nurse, along with my brother coming out of retirement as a paramedic and my nephew being a firefighter. So I got 3 family members that's very close to me that's on the front line when it comes to COVID-19. And to see the failure that existed in the Black community is unreal. Or to hear my daughter talk about a whole family died, it's just unreal. It changed our work in a way of how COVID-19 affected the Black church. It affected us in a way that we're not having church. We're still doing virtual type service. And so with us being a beacon light in our communities and registering people to vote, phone banking taking place in our churches, our canvassers come from our churches. COVID-19 has kind of put a shift in the way where it's a virtual phone banking and it's less personal type interaction. So that has made a change, but it has not detoured us. We're doing it different, but it hasn't detoured us. And I did a test with the primary to see if we can still drive people out to vote during a pandemic. And the success of that was just unreal, where people were just that more determined, because now it's like, I prefer standing in a line. If I'm gonna lose my life, I'm gonna lose it for a reason. And I don't mind standing, because we don't really trust, not that we ever have in Florida, is the vote by mail, because we've often had, when it wasn't a COVID, our ballots have been stuck in post offices. And so that's not new for us, ballots being stuck in the post office and the county mayor saying that they would never be counted. So we've taken the pissed off attitude to be more determined to do what we have to do to drive people out to vote. We can't afford to not to drive this and use this moment, because we realize if we can change Florida, we could really change this country. All eyes are on us, and I'm not talking about the way Tupac said it. All eyes are on Florida, because we could either hold up an election, which we have an anointing in, and or we can make some real stuff happen, because if we're gonna hold it up, it's because we want every vote counted. And so with me having pastors saying, and I'll monitor you counting it, because we want to make sure it be counted. And so I'm just using that to, I want every pastor in Florida to be just as pissed off as I am. And I don't care what neck of the woods you come from. And so I'm learning from Phyllis how to agitate in a way that we get some awesome results. And I could see that happening, and there is a sense of excitement, a sense of urgency, and a whole lot of concern. And
well, thanks, and that's a good handoff back to Phyllis to sort of wrap up our conversation, which clearly could use many hours. But Phyllis, what do you want to add in or leave other organizers thinking about when they hear this conversation? Or do you want to say a word on what happens after we get through this crazy 2020? What's our vision for the kind of organizing we have to do in 2021? Let me give you some moments here.
Just some nuggets that have already been said, which is number one is to believe in our own brilliance. believe in our own experience and kind of organize out of that. People are, you know, for people like myself that come from rural areas, there are no jobs, hardly any jobs. And then the jobs that they say that you can have is like, oh, we're going to build a prison. You know, excuse my language, damn well that ain't right. But at the same time, they're saying you're not good enough, let's say it like that, to have a hospital in which, you know, you that can take care of you. So, you know, those things, like, we have to be able to get people to have their own spirit is telling them that's not right. That's what Pastor Rhonda said. You should be pissed off about that. You have every right to be pissed off. And I'm asking you to walk in that, right? And walking in the brilliance that you know how to solve this problem. And one of the things we have to do is organize our thoughts, organize our people, organize our money around a better life. That's just basic organizing right there. And we've always as Black people, always been able to do that. We don't have to do it like they do it in the Midwest. We don't have to do it like, you know, whatever. We can do it out of our own culture, our own community, the way that we know it. So that's what I walk away with, is that in 2021, in 2022, I really like what Pastor Rhonda and what Nsé is laying out, which is claim what we want. Claim it, and don't matter, and don't get worried or discouraged that it doesn't fit into some neat C3 or C4 line. Who gives a damn? We got to go for it. Sorry, y'all got me after 5 o'clock.
The IRS gives a damn. They care.
They care. Well, you know, we got lawyers and stuff for that. My whole point is that sometimes we get stuck and things being neat and orderly, but we have people to make sure that we do the right things. That's right, Nsé. But one of the things that I take about this conversation from you and Pastor Rhonda is that, you know, moving things legally, being able to sue and having a strategy behind that is the way to go. That it's not some lawsuit or some legality that happened over here while the organizing is detached. And so those things are really important. Other than that, I mean, as I began the conversation, we have to invest in the Pastor Rhondas, the Nsés of the world. That's what it is. And another thing in our conversation is that these women not only deserve budgets that can go from year in to year out, as Nsé laid out an example of Mississippi, but they also need time to rest. Rest is important. So part of our conversation also included, could these budgets also have enough money where they could take a sabbatical? That is unfair that, as Nsé said about the black labor, Black women's labor, my grandmother's labor. I think a lot of us have died too soon because of the stress, have died too soon because we just didn't take care of ourselves and no one was able to take care of us. The many times where we couldn't even have the health care we were fighting for, and then some of us may have it and then couldn't take advantage because we were so busy. So for me, walking in 2021 is also walking in there healthy as much as best as we can be, and taking care of Black women to be able to do so. So that's where I'll end.
All right, well, that's a good place to leave it for tonight, just because I imagine none of y'all get to call it a day, given what you're up against. So you've shared so much. I think we should follow up. We should make sure to lift these stories in the organizing community, and we should begin to address the resource disparities that are out there when it's Black people leading Black communities to organize. So thank you so much for your time, and you know you're going to hear from us on ways to support the work y'all are doing. Hang in there.